Welcome back to my channel. I'm Ashley and this is Sincerely Sews. Recently, Joann Fabrics sent me this huge box full of sewing supplies and fabric. If you want to see what's inside, keep on watching. Joann sent me this knit green fabric with matching earrings, and they even sent some Fiskars cutting supplies like a mini rotary cutter and some new shears. Joann's told me I could do whatever I want with this fabric, so I decided to make a dress for spring. It's a knit jersey material, and I don't typically work with stretch fabrics, so this was a really fun project for me to do. To make this dress, I used the pattern Simplicity 9475. This pattern is actually made to work with woven fabrics, so I had to make a few adjustments to make my knit fabric work. Let's jump right in the tutorial and I'll show you how I used this pattern to make a dress using knit fabric. This pattern has beautiful princess seams across the bust line, but because I'm using a knit fabric, I don't need so much structure. Instead, I'll be taking the pieces from option C, the overlay, and using that for my main body. The bodice is gathered along this edge, which removes the need for any additional shaping. I'm going to make another adjustment, like removing the center front seam by taking away 5/8 of an inch in the front and cutting this piece on the fold instead. Instead of cutting out 3 of the skirt piece, I'm going to cut out 2. That way the overlay will be less full and I'll have room on the side seam to add pockets. Here's what my pattern pieces look like once I started laying them out. I did end up having to go out to the store and buy an extra yard of fabric because I really wanted to include the sleeve piece, but no matter how many times I tried to reconfigure the pieces, I just couldn't make it fit. So overall, I ended up using about 2.5 yards of fabric for this project, and I folded the fabric like this so that I could have room to fit both of the back bodice pieces as well as both of the full skirt pieces on the fabric. The hearts that you see weighing down my pattern pieces are pattern weights that I made this past Valentine's Day. If you follow me on TikTok, you can find my tutorial on how to make them there. My username is Sincerely Sews. The scissors that I'm using to cut out these pattern pieces were also in the box from Joann's. They're made by Fiskars, and I'm delightfully surprised at how sharp they were. They've actually become my new favorite sewing scissors. They have plastic handles, so they're not very heavy in my hand, and I really love that they're sparkly too. Now it's time to start sewing the dress. The first thing I like to do is add the side seam pockets. Place the fabric right sides together and stitch the pocket to the main part of the skirt at about a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Later we'll be sewing the side seam at 5/8 of an inch. Usually I serge around the pocket bags first, but I was eager to get started on this project and I forgot that step. So here I'm just serging the pocket to the side seam of my skirt. Now with the right sides of the fabric facing, I'm adding the front of the skirt to the back of the skirt, and I'm going to leave the pocket hanging out. When I stitch the side seam, I'll sew at 5/8 an inch, and I'll leave an opening here so that you can fit your hand inside the pocket. It's really important to backstitch before and after the opening for the pocket so that the side seam doesn't come undone later. When I was first working on this dress, I was using my Janome sewing machine because I didn't have a ballpoint needle for my industrial machine. This machine has Hello Kitty on it and it looks like a toy, but I promise it's a full-fledged sewing machine. Often when you're working with knits, you'll want to use a zigzag stitch, but because this dress doesn't rely on having too much stretch at the seam, I was able to use a straight stitch with no problems. Here you can see the opening that I've created for the side seam pockets. Next it was time to press the side seam. I set my iron at a low synthetic temperature because that's all that's required for this fabric. Then I press these side seams towards the front so that the pocket will be facing front when you go to put your hand inside. Then the next step for the pockets will be to sew the 2 sides of the pocket bags together. I'm doing this part with my serger because I forgot to serge around the raw edges of the pockets first, which I usually like to do whenever I'm installing side seam pockets. It's really important if you're ever using pins near your serger to make sure that you take them out before you get even close to the pin. Otherwise, the pin could get cut off by your serger and go flying into your eye or dull the blades of your serger. After serging around the edges of the pocket bags, I tacked the seam allowance in place with my sewing machine just to make sure that everything was staying right where it's supposed to. Next I sewed the gathering stitches at the top edge of my skirt by creating a very long stitch, 5/8 and about 4/8 of an inch away from the top edge of the fabric. I like to use 2 rows of gathering stitches in case one breaks. Here's how the skirt part of my dress is looking so far. Now I'm moving on to the sleeves. I first sewed the side seam of the sleeves, and now I'm adding a rolled hem to the edge. In retrospect, I wish that I had put a more wide hem because the skinny narrow hem on a stretch fabric likes to flip up. Here's what the dress is looking like without the bodice. Now it's time to get started on that. The first step in sewing the bodice is to add the stitches for gathering all the way across the bottom. Then I'll also add 2 rows of gathering stitches at each shoulder because I'll be gathering those seams together as well. Here you can see me adding the gathering stitches at one of the shoulder seams. And here I'm adding the second row of gathering stitches about 1/8 of an inch away from that first line. Now that I have all of the gathering stitches sewn on the bodice, it's time to sew the shoulders together. We'll come back to the gathering stitches across the bottom of this bodice later. If you gather one edge of the fabric and sew it to another gathered edge, the fabric will not be very stable and it will be easy for the gathering to slip around. To avoid stretching, I'll be sewing each part of the shoulder seam to a piece of twill tape that's cut to the length of the overall shoulder seam. This will add stability and structure to the shoulder seam. I also added fray check to the edges of the twill tape, but that's not really necessary since eventually everything gets encased in serging. Here I'm pulling the gathers of the shoulder seam so that I can pin it to the twill tape, but I'm making sure to leave the 5/8 inch seam allowance on either side out of my stitching line. After I have it pinned in place, I'll sew at a regular stitch length across the entire length of the gathers that will lock them in place. After that, I sewed the 2 shoulder seams together and then serged the raw edge. Here's what the gathered shoulder piece looks like. It's still stretchy up and down, but it won't stretch out the shoulder. After that, I sewed the side seams of the dress and then I pressed them towards the back. Next, I added some gathering stitches at the top edge of the sleeve and pinned it in place around the armhole. Here's the dress before the bodice and skirt are attached. What's left is the waistband and to finish the neckline. Now it's time to sew the waistband. I added interfacing and turned up the edge of the facing piece of the waistband, and then I sewed the gathering stitches where indicated in the instructions. After that, I started sewing the waistband to both the skirt and the bodice of the dress, which kind of creates a little bit of a sandwich. Then I stitched in the ditch to close up the entire waistband. The last step of the waistband is to top stitch the gathering in place. Next, I measured around the raw edge of my neckline. I'm going to be creating a band instead of using the facing pieces that come with the pattern because I'm working with a knit fabric instead of a woven. Lay the strip of the neckband on the V-neck of the bodice and trace it with an erasable pen. This line will become a stitching line for the neckband that will give us a precise V shape for this specific neckline. After stitching the 2 parts of the neckline together, I trimmed off the excess and then clipped into the V without cutting past the pivoted corner. Now I'm ready to stitch this neckband in place. I marked the apex of the V neckline at 5/8 of an inch so that I know exactly where to stitch the point. Sew all the way up to that apex point and then sink your needle so that you can turn and pivot to sew the other side of the neckline. I also clip right up to the apex point so that I can spread open the neckline and turn the corner a lot easier. Now I'm ready to finish stitching the neckband. Here's how the finished neckband looks. Another modification I'm making to this pattern is adding straps on the back like this. To make the straps, I cut a 1 inch wide section of fabric. Then I grabbed some acrylic yarn. It's necessary to use acrylic yarn for this step because if you use a natural fiber, it might break. Cut a piece of yarn that's a little bit longer than the strap and tie a knot in one end. Take the strap over to your machine and lay the piece of yarn running down the center of the strap. Then fold the strap in half. When we go to stitch this in place, it's important to stitch right through the yarn with a back stitch so that it doesn't pull out when we go to turn the strap right side out. Then go ahead and turn the corner and stitch the rest of the seam at 1/4 of an inch all the way down. This next step is so satisfying. Start pulling on the yarn and gather the strap towards the side with the knot. Keep pushing the gathers towards the knot and pull on the seam a little bit to get the turn started. Then just keep pulling on the yarn and your strap will be turned right side out almost like magic. Then you can cut off the excess piece of yarn and the strap is ready to use. The last step is to tack these straps in place on the back of the dress. I also created waist ties for this dress, but I forgot to film that step. It's really just a rectangular piece of fabric turned right side out. I'm really happy with how this dress turned out. Let's check out that final photo shoot. One of the things that I really love about sewists on social media is that everyone can take the standard commercial pattern and adjust it to meet their own needs. Just like I've done with a knit fabric here, I've seen this dress made with lots of different varieties of fabrics. If you've used this sewing pattern, drop me a comment below and let me know how your dress turned out. Thank you for hanging out with me today. It was really fun to show you how I made this dress. If you watched my video this far, you should definitely drop a comment and a like so that I can make more content like this in the future. I have new sewing content coming out for you all summer, and I'm really excited to show you the next project I've been working on. And as always, thank you so much for watching.
Thank you to Joann for providing the supplies for today's project.